Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful summer evening. I'm happy to be doing this presentation. I love talking about history, and the history of our Racine parishes is a very special story. So with no further ado, and can people all see the screen okay? Are the lights interfering or anything? We're all good. Okay. So the faith communities of Racine, Catholic parishes, American story. How did we get here? How did we get to a situation today where we have 12 parishes in Racine, and not that long ago, 17? The broad overview of what we're going to talk about tonight will be the story of immigration, which is the American story, acknowledging, of course, the fact that Native Americans were here when waves of immigrants, beginning with those who climbed onto Plymouth Rock, and continuing to the present day, continue to shape the story of our nation. The story of these parishes is a story of sacrifice and struggle to build these parishes. Ethnic parishes rooted in place, and we'll hear more about that notion. We're also tonight going to track the societal changes of the times, of the various eras here in Racine and in the nation. And those include the waves of immigration, the crises of the 1930s and 1940s, Depression and World War, and then the boom years of the 1950s and 60s. We'll also, in the context of change and the 1960s, talk about what was brought about in our church by the Second Vatican Council. And then we'll narrow our focus and look at the changing social and economic picture in Racine, the profound social changes, as well as the de-industrialization of our city and what that has meant for where we are today. So by way of focusing a little more on this issue of immigration, we can speak, historians speak, of 3 eras of immigration, and to that we should now add a 4th. There's the experience of colonial America and the early republic, 1634 to 1829, and Catholics in this early period constituted roughly 1% of the United States at the time of the American Revolution. And then what we now call the old immigration, consisting largely of Germans and Irish, fleeing both political persecution as well as economic turmoil. In the case of the Irish, fleeing famine at home and seeking opportunities and a new life in the United States. So 1830 to 1880s would be that wave of old immigration. And then the new European immigration, the 1880s to 1920, when, as we'll see, Congress, through legislation, cut off that flow of immigration and what the consequences of that would be even here in Racine. That new European immigration consisted largely of people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. And now we have a newer immigration yet, Central America and beyond. The Racine Catholic story mirrors all of this. The first Catholic church in Racine, made up of a few Yankee settlers, people who came here from New York and from Massachusetts, founded the first parish in Racine, St. Luke's, in 1842 on 5th Street. This closed after only 3 years in 1845, and the property was sold off. Why such a short life? Well, first of all, the congregation outgrew the building. And secondly, the Episcopalians already had a church by that same name. I mean, I always think of Episcopalians when I hear St. Luke. And a church that, in fact, had been founded in the very same year. Taking its place, then, was a new parish, 1845 founding, St. Ignatius, on the corner of 8th and Lake Avenues. A church that has been referred to by Father Thomas Morrissey, who along with Father Martin Kundig were circuit rider priests coming down from Milwaukee and serving the Catholics in Racine. Father Thomas Morrissey is quoted as saying that St. Ignatius was the mother of the Catholic churches in Racine. It was the heart of Catholicity in this section of the country. Then out of St. Ignatius came two new parishes. In 1852, as you see here, Racine's German Catholics left St. Ignatius and founded their own parish, St. Mary's, at the corner of College Avenue and 8th. St. Ignatius, continuing on from this history here, St. Ignatius could not support the growing number of English-speaking Catholics, that is the Irish, meaning that the church was too small to contain that growing number of people. And so a new church, St. Patrick's, was built north of the Root River in 1856. So you see kind of two groups seceding here. First the Germans going off on their own, and then the overflow of Irish going north of the river. St. Ignatius then, having lost a substantial amount of its membership, particularly with the secession of the Germans, ended up closing in 1862. So what we've seen so far now, we've seen examples of the old immigration here in Racine with the Germans at St. Mary's, the Irish at St. Patrick, and now in fairly rapid succession, three new parishes from these two groups of old immigration would come to be here in Racine. St. Joseph, the German parish on the north side, St. Rose, an Irish parish on the south side, St. Patrick on the north, St. Rose on the south, and then a second German parish, Holy Name, on the south side. Now, it's easy to mock this, and I confess that I have sometimes done this. You know, God forbid you have to cross the river to go to church, but from the St. Joseph parish history, they note that it will be noted that during periods of open water, it was necessary to ferry across the river. There weren't bridges. The cost was a penny per person per ride. And then, of course, during cold weather, the river was frozen over, and a walk across spared the ferry expense, but of course introduced its own risk. Yeah. In early, in fall and spring, we don't need to belabor this point. And then the St. Joseph history goes on. Speculation has it that a number of those pennies saved found their way into the collection box. Collection was a matter of penny ante in those days. So yeah, I mean, really, crossing the river was an obstacle to church attendance. And then I noted also, a penny a ride, penny over, penny back, big family, at a point where an average working man made $32 a month, those pennies added up. So as an example of this old immigration, let's stick with St. Joseph's for a minute or two here. In a typical pattern, St. Joe's built their school first in 1870, with the church following in 1876. And St. Joe's enjoyed the support of German, and I put that in quotation marks because, as we'll see, we're talking about either Bavaria or Austria. St. Joe's enjoyed the support of German mission societies in decorating and furnishing their church. Now, I had long heard, in a sort of oral tradition, that St. Joe's received money from an organization called the Ludwigsmissionverein, or the St. Ludwig Mission Organization, Society, but I'd never been able to run that down to ground. I spent some time last week up at the Archdiocesan Archive and found on their website and printed the passage that generous benefactions from missionary societies in France, Bavaria, and Austria, Bavaria being this Ludwig-Verein, and Austria being the Leopoldine-Gesellschaft. Examples of churches that enjoyed such benefaction were Old St. Mary's in Milwaukee, St. Joseph in Racine, and Holy Name in Sheboygan. Now, we don't yet know for certain if St. Joe's got its money from Bavaria or Austria. The archivist in Milwaukee, Shelley Taylor, put me on to a British scholar currently teaching in the Netherlands who spent time at the archive in Milwaukee because he's writing a book-length study on this Leopoldine Society. I wrote to him, but he hasn't gotten back to me yet. So the next time I give this talk, we'll know for sure which German organization contributed to the beautiful interior furnishing of St. Joe's. But let's turn now to the new immigration, the Southern and Eastern European immigration, and its impact, first nationally. In 1880, at the very start of this wave of immigration, Catholics made up 8% of the U.S. population. That is roughly 6.6 million out of a 76 million country as a whole. But by 1910, before this wave of immigration had fully crested, Catholics were now almost 18% of the population, 16 million out of 92 million nationwide. In Racine, this new immigration had an impact. Racine's population grew by over 60% in the years from 1880 to 1910. Just think about that for a minute. In the space of 30 years, an increase of 60%. And this was due largely to immigration and the industrialization of the economy that was drawing these immigrants. And coming, as new immigrants were, from Southern and Eastern Europe, the majority of them were Catholic. In Racine, then, this meant a wave of new parishes. 1896, St. John Nepomuk for the Moravian, Bohemian, Czech, just a brief little discourse into the Habsburg Empire here. What we knew as Czechoslovakia as late as 1993 was made up of Czechs, Moravians, and Slovaks. And then that country peacefully separated in 1993. And what we today call the Czech Republic is made up of Czechs and Moravians. And then the Slovaks have their own country, Slovakia. The people who came to Racine and founded St. John Nepomuk were overwhelmingly Moravian. 1903, another parish, St. Stanislaus for the Poles, then St. Casimir for the Lithuanians, Holy Trinity for the Slovaks, Sacred Heart for the Italians, say more about that in a minute, and then St. Lucy, Hungarian and Italian. I'll say a little more about that one too. And the particular, rather unique origins of St. Lucy coming out of the Catholic Instruction League movement. Again, it's kind of easy to mock this idea, you know, not one immigrant group arrived in Racine, but that they didn't found their own parish. But this is happening against the backdrop of a wider vision within the Catholic Church, captured best, perhaps, by Chicago Archbishop James Quigley, who said that his vision was no square mile without a parish church. Just feature. Father Juan is just blanching at the thought. No square mile without a parish church, so that the pastor can personally know every man, woman, and child. And then from St. John Nepomuk's written parish history, a phrase that just really arrested me. Like other immigrants, they desired to hear the word of God in their own language. And isn't this, of course, the promise of Pentecost? They each heard the word in their own language. Okay. So let's talk a little more about St. John Nepomuk. It is the classic example of an immigrant ethnic parish. We mentioned that the people came largely from Moravia, from the village of Verchnov. Got that right, Pete? Yes. Okay, thank you. Good conversation over coffee with Pete Sizek a couple weeks ago, and from the region of Uherský Brod. They were drawn here, as immigrants are, by promise of jobs, and often by word of mouth. Relatives came over and sent word back to the cousins, and they came. And so again, this, you know, clustering of people coming from the same area. The Czech-speaking Moravians began worshiping at St. Joe's because many of them knew German, because they were subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the official language in the empire was German. And only slowly were the other ethnic groups' languages fully recognized. But again, this desire to hear the word of God in their own language, in their true mother tongue, is what led them to found their own parish. The religious life at St. John Nepomuk reinforced the cultural identity and vice versa. Nearly from the beginning, there were parish festivals featuring ethnic foods and crafts. This festival would later, much later, 1987, come to be known as Bohemian Fest, and again, putting that name on at a point in time where the ethnic identity might some way be fading was an attempt to continue to emphasize those origins. Special occasions at the church saw sermons preached in both English and Czech, right up to 1928 when the new church, the present church, was built. First you had an English sermon and then you had a Czech sermon. Parish minutes were published in Czech alongside English right up to 1947. And the 50th anniversary book, just a year before that in 1946, was published in Czech and in English. St. John's was a parish marked by a great deal of stability and tradition, typical of ethnic communities. You know, they've already had so much upheaval and uprootedness in their life, so you found your parish and you want things stable. 2 pastors in 68 years, Father, later Monsignor Weiler, and then Father Joseph Masick. And in tradition that can sometimes be not a good thing, a 1953 motion to allow women to attend parish meetings as non-voting members was defeated. No, don't want women to even attend the meetings, despite, and was it Leo Meyer who wrote the, Lloyd Meyer who wrote the parish history with a, witty turn of phrase from time to time. Obviously, he writes, with no sensitivity to the fact that the Women's Suffrage Amendment, whose anniversary is today, by the way, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution had been passed by Congress in 1920, but not at St. John Nepomuk. Women are not voting, they're not even in the room. Okay, little too much tradition. Another North Side ethnic parish, Sacred Heart, founded in 1916. Again, the oral tradition and the common belief is that Sacred Heart was an Italian parish, but interestingly, the published histories that Lena so kindly loaned me do not make that explicit claim. The published histories do state that the parish organized missions post-1917, once the parish itself was founded, that they organized missions for Italian and Hungarian-speaking persons on the North Side. The 1917 annual status report that I was able to view last week up at the archive shows that the report filed that year, in 1917, in the line that says number of souls. The pastor wrote 500. And then he toted up at the bottom nationality by nationality and then drew a little total line, 19 nationalities in all. But of those 500, 150 were Italian, so the majority, and 100 German, so together almost half. And I think I will rest my case, and Sacred Heart people can walk out of here secure in the knowledge that the precursor of Sacred Heart here on the North Side was a little chapel called Our Lady of Mount Carmel, Italian. The first pastor, a Father Peter Enrietto, Italian, 1916, 1935, the years of his pastorate here. And he served as part-time chaplain at, he served at Mount Carmel part-time. His full-time job was chaplain at St. Mary's Hospital. Am I blocking the screen if I stand behind the podium? No, it's okay, good. And then the final, yes, I think we've nailed it here. Ethnic traditions, the Ferragosto, the very traditional Italian celebrations surrounding August 15th. This began at Sacred Heart in 1939, was called the Ferragosto celebration. Later that term got dropped and it just became the Parish Festival, but I think all those things add up to establishing an Italian ethnic identity for Sacred Heart. Okay, St. Sebastian, founded in 1905, and this to me, I confess, was a big surprise. Here I'm grateful to Ann Wainert for loaning me her collection of St. Sebastian histories. I had always assumed, and again, I'm not from here, I've been here 43 years, but that's still a newcomer in Racine. I just assumed that St. Sebastian was a product of Racine urban sprawl. It's a kind of 60s, 70s looking church, 1974 as it turns out, and I never thought more deeply about it. But of course, it turns out it was a rural parish, and ethnically a German parish, in fact, if not in name. So de facto, a German parish. One needs only to look at the names, and I didn't even write them all down here, of the early parishioners at St. Sebastian to see that these were Germans, German farmers. The founding story is that a Father Philip Dries, who was the pastor of St. Louis in Caledonia, was asked by these German farmers to come and say Mass down in what was then known as Corliss. And how did he get there? He took the train. Ding! That train, which predates Highway 11 and all the other means of connecting up with the parishes, all he had to do was say Mass at St. Louis, get on the train, and get down to Corliss, Caledonia, and say Mass there. The first Mass at the request of these Corliss Sturtevant German farmers was held in Ligsweiler Hall with the smell of stale beer and cigar smoke in the air from the night before. And the big concern in the early years at St. Sebastian's, as one gleans from repeated references in the written history, building enough stabling stalls and hitching posts for the horses, because everybody came to church in a horse and buggy or in a horse and wagon. So the precursor of worrying about parking lots, building enough spaces for the horses. And this is an actual photo from the St. Sebastian history of people arriving for Mass with the horse. St. Sebastian's long had a connection to St. Bonaventure Seminary with the Franciscan priests, the Franciscan friars. From 1920 to 2006, St. Sebastian was staffed by the Franciscans, the school having been established in 1921, closed in 1983. And sadly, the building that was St. Bonaventure's is now the core building of the Racine Correctional Institution. They've built around it and expanded, but somewhere at the heart of that are the buildings that were once St. Bonaventure. Whoops. St. Lucy, a unique case here, 1917. St. Lucy was first established as a Catholic Instruction League chapel. The Catholic Instruction League, think of it as a precursor of the CCD movement, a phrase, a name we are more familiar with. This movement began in Chicago and was brought to Milwaukee. The concern was that throughout the country, and even here in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and despite the network of Catholic schools that we're going to hear about in just a couple of minutes, the majority of Catholic children still went to public school. And in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee in this decade, it was 75% of Catholic children were in fact in public school. So this is the kind of thing that gave rise to this, we've got to find a way to educate these children in the faith. And that movement began in Chicago, was brought to Milwaukee, and was put in the hands of a Marquette Jesuit named Father Leo Lyons, who then began to set up Catholic Instruction League programs throughout the Archdiocese. Marquette University Religion Theology faculty providing the instruction to lay teachers. And it is acknowledged in Father Steve Avella's History of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, in The Richness of the Earth, the name of that book, that Racine was his most successful endeavor. And he writes, Father Ravello writes, the target communities of the Catholic Instruction League were Italians and Hungarians who flocked to the CIL's Lakeside Center. Lakeside being that area along the lake for us, you old-timers, us old-timers. The Racine tractor plant right there on the lake. Okay, that whole area there. And they actually then built a chapel. What they did, let's see, the chapel, did I put it in here? Yes, what they did is they purchased the old Italian Mutual Aid Society building and then turned that into their chapel. And here we have a picture of people from this community. In 1933, in a building that still exists there on Howe Street, the chapel was replaced with a new church. Each family was asked to donate either $30 or 60 hours of labor to build this church. And many, in fact, donated many times more of that in labor. This is the height of the Depression, 1933. And so $30 would have been a tremendous sacrifice. Labor was something that people had, in fact, because many of them were unemployed at the time. So you go build the church. St. Lucy's officially became a parish only in 1958. It still had this rather ambiguous status. And the first pastor, a Father Francis Vida, born in Hungary in 1919, ordained in Rome in 1943 in the midst of the Second World War, so he had gotten out of Hungary. This is a story I'd like to research more. And in Rome, he was ministering to Hungarian refugees living in Italy. He came to the United States, came to Milwaukee, and was sent to St. Louis, to St. Lucy in 1952, and he would stay there, being officially raised to the rank of pastor in 1958, when it became officially a parish. He would stay there the rest of his life until his death in 1987. All of this kind of by way, there's some dispute in Racine about whether St. Lucy is an Italian parish or a Hungarian parish, and I think we need to give credit to both. And I think the presence of Father Vida is certainly something that maybe even tips the balance a little bit in favor of Hungarians. Whoops. A masterful study of this whole period of American church history is found in this book, Parish Boundaries, by John McGreevy, who was a historian at Notre Dame, eventually became their dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And in this book, Parish Boundaries, the subtitle, The Catholic Encounter with Race in the 20th Century Urban North, he makes the point that ethnic Catholics, and again, this is what we've been talking about, right? Ethnic parishes here in Racine. Ethnic Catholics identified with their parish and their neighborhood. Both were their home, to the point that people would say, I live in St. John Nepomuc. I live in Sacred Heart. I live in St. Joseph's. They were invested in their parish literally. McGreevy points out that many pastors encouraged parishioners to take out second mortgages on their house to provide funds for the church. Unlike Protestant or Jewish congregations, McGreevy points out, that could up and refound themselves in different parts of the city or in the suburbs as the cities changed, Catholic parishes were rooted in place. They rose and they fell with the fate of the neighborhood. And this is the story that McGreevy then gets into, the Catholic encounter with race in the urban north, and how that would come to play out by the 1960s in a time of dramatic economic and social change. He writes about the sense of betrayal that many white ethnic Catholics felt as their neighborhoods changed around them, as they saw many priests and nuns taking part in the civil rights movement, even if they might in theory agree with the notion of civil rights, as they saw their changing neighborhoods. All of this comes into play. This is a tremendous book. It is one of the best history books I've read, And I recommend it for, to get a national understanding of this picture that we've been talking about on the very local level. And mentioning the second mortgages taken out, we have examples here of how all of these sacrifices played into building our parishes. Going back to Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, he points out that the United States has always been a volunteer society. We have no established religion, no state support of religion, so it's up to us. It's up to the people to do this. From St. John Nepomuc's parish history, there's a phrase, without much more security than the will to survive, people went ahead and raised the necessary funds to keep that parish going. The blizzards of bazaars, bake sales, brick sales, craft sales, parish festivals, we've all taken part in these school fundraisers, parish dinners, all of the things that have supported, built, and sustained these parishes over the years. We already mentioned the St. Lucie example, $30 or 60 hours of labor. Here at Sacred Heart, it was the men of the parish who turned out to do the excavating for the foundation of the first church, one shovel at a time. St. Sebastian's, from the beginning, all the maintenance at the church and later the school was done by volunteer labor. And perhaps the most striking, remarkable example, where's Nancy McLaughlin? Get ready for this, Nancy. A plan for refinancing the parish was proposed and adopted, a plan centering around the investment by the members of the parish of their savings in their parish. Sacred Heart became a bank. In this way, funds were available for the parish to meet its obligations through the savings of its people, while guaranteeing them a safe investment. What do you think, Nancy? Forensic banker, as you are? That explains the big safe in the old rectory. Okay, there you go. There's a historical explanation for everything. And then jumping ahead chronologically, St. Edward in 1958, when they finally built a convent and added several classrooms onto the school, the goal of that fundraising campaign was $250,000, of which St. Ed's raised $406,000, equivalent to $3.6 million today. Now we're talking the late 50s, we're talking the era of boom and prosperity, which we'll get to in a minute, but still, remarkable sacrifice. The importance of a school. We've mentioned schools here from time to time. The Baltimore Council of 1852 states bishops are exhorted to have a Catholic school in every parish. And here in Racine, we see a number of parishes that built schools before they built a church, or maybe built a combination school and church before they built a separate dedicated worship space. You can see your names there. Or these were the exceptions, and a couple of these, St. Casimir, St. Paul's, never had a school. Others did build a church before they did a school. St. Sebastian's noticed no school until 1956, even though the parish had been there since '05. So kind of a 50-50 split here in Racine. We'd really be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the role of the Racine Dominican sisters in staffing these schools in Racine. Yes. Yes. In fact, it would be easier to say what schools they didn't staff. They were briefly at St. John Nepomuc until 1917, when the School Sisters of St. Francis from Milwaukee, and then a Polish order, the Sisters of St. Joseph from Stevens Point, staffed the school at St. Stanislaus. Special mention should be given here of St. Patrick's, the site of the first Racine Dominican convent, or mother house, across the street on Douglas. This house still stands today. And the Racine Dominicans, Mother Benedicta Bauer and her companion, Sister Thomasina Ginker, arriving here in 1862 in Racine, opened the first Catholic school in Racine. Douglas Avenue, then called St. Clair Street, here on parenthetically noted there. Underneath this staffing on the part of the sisters is the incredible sacrifice, financial and physical, that these women endured. They not only taught school to large classes, sometimes 70 to 80 to 100 children at a time per room, for small stipends that were paid to the mother house. In addition to that, they were expected to clean the church and the school and often the rectory as well, and then give music lessons on the side. They often lived in hand-me-down housing, buildings that had been built as rectories and then were turned over to the sisters when a nicer rectory was built for the priests. Just to name a few examples of where that happened: St. John Nepomuk, St. Sebastian's. That's the picture there of the one-time rectory, then convent. Now it's the antique store there on Durand. The most egregious example of ill treatment, it pains me to say, came from St. Edward, where from 1927, when the school opened, until 1958, when they built the convent, now the child care center, the sisters slept in one classroom, separated into 8 cubicles with curtains. That's the picture on the left. Their bathroom was the girls' lavatory, and once a week, women from the parish drove them down to the mother house on Park Street so they could have a bath. Now, when people wax nostalgic about the good old days and the good sisters, let's remember the kind of sacrifices and even the indignity that underlay some of this. This here, then, this is from the fundraising book at St. Ed's for that campaign that raised the equivalent of $3.6 million, part of it being, building this new convent. So that's then the kind of room that the sisters got. So let's return to our chronological narrative here. We're now up to World War I and the post-war era. The war itself, of course, interrupted the flow of immigration. And then by 1919, 1920, as the United States retreats into this mode of isolationism, legislation going through Congress to impose steep quotas on immigration, which brings us to a new kind of parish in a new neighborhood in Racine, St. Edward, the original little wooden church, and then the church that we have today. Why is this a new kind of parish? Well, the first time I wrote the history of St. Ed's was back in 1994 for our 75th anniversary, and I got a bunch of people together after Mass and brought donuts and juice and said, tell me what you remember from your parents and your grandparents. And the phrase that came up over and over again, this was the first non-ethnic parish in Racine. I have to look into this, I thought. And it turns out the technical name for this is a territorial parish, one that serves the neighborhood, not an ethnic group. And West Racine at that time, the streets weren't even paved yet. Basically went up to West Boulevard, and beyond that were still dirt paths. It was a new neighborhood. And what this meant, as they were quickly building these houses then in the 1920s and paving the roads, it was a sign that Catholics were increasingly moving out of the central city, their first neighborhoods of settlement, moving away from their ethnic parishes, moving into an area that had already, on its eastern fringes, been settled by the Danes, who had made their second move from the near north side. All of this a sign of the growing economic prosperity and assimilation of Catholics. And the name, St. Edward the Confessor, deliberately chosen as an English saint to avoid association with any continental saints. Well, we already had a St. Joseph, but, give me some examples. Somebody could say St. Boniface. Okay, well, that's really a German parish. No, can't be that. So they wanted to avoid any association with those continental ethnic groups. And because there are not a whole lot of English Catholics, we'll just pick an English saint and everybody's happy. And then, as I already mentioned, the building of the school, 1926, officially opened in 1927, which served as the church and the convent until 1954, the church, and actually that should be 1953. 1953, the church, and 1958, the convent. I must say, since this is basically the view out of my front window, that I do wish those trees were still there on the corner, and I think the old windows are more attractive than what we have now, but you know. Okay, we need to do a quick acknowledgement because I wanted to make sure everybody got mentioned here tonight of St. Rita. And I'll just, and Father Mike is here? Yes, good. There we are. Okay, and I'll just read directly here from their history website. In the early 1920s, a village known as Ives, located north of the city, a wild town, known for taverns and gambling dens. In 1925, the Augustinian priests and brothers arrived and forever changed it. They bought a bowling alley and turned it into a chapel. South of the chapel stood Ives Tavern, a place constantly running afoul of prohibition, a hotbed of crime and vice. The Augustinians purchased that and turned it into a parish hall, and then the Ives Hotel, another establishment known for illegal sale of beverages. They bought that as well and turned that into their school. And then the Racine Dominicans came in to staff the school, a parish of 15 different nationalities and so on and so forth. And the town was, through the influence of the Augustinians, they actually, for a time, changed the name of Ives to St. Rita before it became incorporated into Racine. St. Rita continued to serve as an Augustinian monastery and thus has a connection to Pope Leo XIV, who used to come up here from Chicago when he was the head of the Augustinians in the United States to spend the weekend visiting the novices. So we should get a historic, designation plaque on those old buildings. Pope Leo stayed here. And then it was in 2019 that the Augustinians consolidated their facilities, their schools, and moved away from St. Rita. In 2019, the Archdiocese assigned the first diocesan priest ever to staff St. Rita's, Father Mike Peterson. So from drunkenness and debauchery to the Augustinians, to Father Mike. Okay, check. We've talked about St. Rita's. Moving along, because I've still got a few minutes here. The 1930s and 40s, the decade of emergencies, depression, Second World War, little to no building possible, but still the parish has continued to grow. And I'll just let you take a look at some of the numbers here from 1920 versus 1940. St. John Nepomuk, 2,700. This is the ongoing story of the growth of the city to the north. And Pete was telling me about repeated discussion of founding yet another parish on the north side, in addition to St. John Nep and St. Rita's, plans that never came to fruition. But they were all cramming into St. John Nepomuk. It was a time of rich parish organizations, and again, you can find your parishes here in the names of these things, everything from Holy Name Society to Sodality, Christian Mothers, Scouting, so on, all of these activities, card parties, bazaars, smokers, something which has gone the way of, the Surgeon General report. Thank goodness. And then the post-World War II era, the boom years, the era of bricks and mortar. And time to build. And one of the first beneficiaries of this was St. Edward, which built the present church, dedicated in 1953. And then, as we've already said, in 58, a school addition, and finally a convent. Not just buildings, but numbers are up, and again, you can look at some of these numbers for 1960 and 1970. St. Edward's with 7,000 members. St. John, and reflecting perhaps, something of a slowdown of growth on the north side, around 4,000. But you see all of that, continued growth. And not just St. Edward's undergoing this building boom, but parishes all across the city, including some of the old original ethnic parishes. St. Mary's built a new church, 1961. Holy Trinity, the Slovak parish, and St. Stanislaus, the Polish parish. Those buildings respectively, in 57 and 63. Sacred Heart built a school. They had an old building that no longer served, tore that down, built this. St. Lucie, now raised to parish status, moved out of that little building on Howe Street and first built a school and temporary church in the late 50s, Sacred Heart. St. Sebastian's finally built their school. And a new church, 1974, St. John Nepomuk, a new rectory and a new convent, both in the 60s. And then St. Lucie, coming in a little later after the building boom, building their church in 1997, the old church again on the right. And then a whole new parish to the west, St. Paul's. First in 1963, and how many of us remember where that shopping center is now? Kohl's and all of that? Okay, that's where St. Paul's was. They sold that land and I think made a bundle. Yes. And then moved out to Spring Street and built the present church. In retrospect, and from our present perspective, we can ask, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? And this brings us to the topic, the issue of this golden age of Catholicism in the 50s, and this from the Centennial booklet for St. Edward's, which I also wrote, so I'm free to quote from it. In retrospect, the 1950s appear as a golden age of church and parish life. We should recognize, however, that the era rested on certain assumptions which many would find unacceptable today. The absolute and unquestioned authority of the pastor, limited roles for the laity, women in particular, and the reliance upon the largely unpaid and often unacknowledged labor of the sisters. With all that, the decade of the 1950s was, for the church in the United States, a period of unparalleled growth in membership, in participation, in buildings and institutions. It contributed to the belief that the church was destined to continue to grow and expand, hence this building boom. At the same time, and paradoxically, this growth contributed to an illusion of stability, of a fixed and unchanging church. The decade of the 1960s would sorely test those assumptions and in some cases undermine and destroy them. And the first big change occurring already early in the 60s, the Second Vatican Council, with reverberations still to the present, raising this revolution of rising expectations, as historians talk about. For some, there was too much change. For others, not enough. You know, we're going to change. We're going to have women priests. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. And when some of those things didn't happen, people became disillusioned. These changes in the church were happening against a backdrop of profound social change here in the United States. The questioning of authority coming out of the experiences of Vietnam and Watergate, the upending of traditional hierarchies and a kind of culture of deference and respect. Gone. The women's movement, introducing new roles and new opportunities for women, of which I'm a beneficiary. It never dawned on me when I started college that a woman could be a professor. Those doors were just opening up just in the 1970s. The women's movement, we recognize too, has an impact on family life and family size. And then a de-industrializing society with the need then often for two-income families as those high-paying industrial union jobs went away. Here in Racine, we narrow our focus now to our own city. Industries lost since the 1970s. Just take a look. You'll recognize lots of those names. And with them, the loss of those jobs, and even more. All of this led to, of course, a loss of jobs, changing neighborhoods, urban decline, growth and development occurring further to the north, further to the west, west of the eye. Lower paying jobs, we've already mentioned, the impact on women's roles. And with all of this, a lack of time as people are working longer and harder and both husband and wife are working, a lack of time for the social and parish organizations. that had sustained that life of the parish for so long. The result is that Racine today is older, poorer, and smaller than it was. The population in 1970, 95,000. In 2020, 77,000. In 2023, 12% of Racinians are 65 or older, 23% Black, 13% Latino, and I think it's probably because of the large traditional Latino families that the percentage of older people is not greater than it is there. Archdiocesan statistics, and these were the most recent statistics, unfortunately, I could get my hands on. They're already 15 years old, but they point to trends we still recognize. 18% fewer Catholics than there were in 1970, and that would be even a little smaller today. In 1970, there were 587 active archdiocesan priests. It's projected by 2020 that number will be 100, and I think that's on, Father Juan is nodding, yeah. Father Moulter, when he celebrated his 60th anniversary a year ago, Father Moulter, many of you know, came here in 1964 as a newly ordained priest. First assignment at St. Ed's, later on his last assignment at St. Ed's. But he pointed out that when he came to Racine in 1964, there were 50 priests in Racine, 50. Today there are 6. Now, this is mitigated somewhat by some of the reforms of Vatican II, the revival of the permanent diaconate. There are today 13 deacons serving Racine's 12 parishes, and by the opening up of lay ministry. By virtue of our baptism, say the documents of Vatican II, we all share in the priestly ministry as lectors and as Eucharistic ministers. Nevertheless, all of these changes brought about a merger, a reorganization of parishes in 1998. St. Richard is the creation of that, formed by the consolidation of those old ethnic parishes we met at the beginning of the hour. Holy names, St. Rose, St. Stanislaus, St. Casimir, and Holy Trinity. And we'll just acknowledge and remember briefly each of those. Holy name, which is, of course, the site of St. Richard. St. Rose, St. Casimir, Holy Trinity, the Slovak parish, and St. Stanislaus, the saddest fate of all, because the congregation that bought them went bankrupt, and the building stands abandoned and surrounded by a cyclone fence and broken windows, and very, very sad. Whoops. St. Richard was blessed in its first years by 2 extraordinary pastors. Many of you remember them, Father Jack Kern and Father Ron Gramsa, who really created a community out of those 5 parishes. And then we have new developments at an old ethnic parish, St. Patrick, the Irish, remember them? Okay. Now overwhelmingly a Latino parish. St. Patrick, let's just quickly acknowledge, established way back there in the beginning with the old immigration. Shout out to Jeff Greiveldinger, who has done a tremendous presentation on the history of the building, the architectural significance. We'll have to get him to give that talk again sometime. He emailed his regrets this morning. He and his wife are traveling, otherwise he'd be here. But the church is a national landmark. How did St. Patrick's become the Latino parish? Well, the presence of Latinos goes back nearly 100 years, mostly initially settling on the south side and going to St. Lucy's when it was still that Catholic Instruction League chapel. By the 1960s, there was a Spanish center established on the north side, very near St. Patrick Church, and that became a magnet for bringing more and more Hispanics, Latinos to that part of the city. And then by the late 1970s, there was tension between the older Irish congregation and the Latino congregants, and St. Mary's Parish, in a rare example of a parish that does up and refound itself elsewhere, St. Mary's moved out of the central city, where basically in that part of town there were few to no residents anymore, and they became St. Mary's by the Lake. And so the St. Mary's building, built in 1961, was empty, and Archbishop Rembert Weekland gave it to the Latino community from St. Patrick. And in a march, they left St. Patrick Church, walked over the bridge, got a bridge over the river now, and went and took possession of St. Mary's, leaving St. Patrick for a time with a minority Latino congregation. But by the early 2000s, that's changed again. Continued migration, large families, means that St. Patrick, again, is majority Latino. Father Anthony, who many of us remember, is pastor of both Cristo Rey, as the old St. Mary's became, and St. Patrick, both parishes struggling financially. He urged parishioners to work together, and in 2014, in a reversal of the secession procession, they held a final mass at Cristo Rey, locked the doors, and marched back over the bridge to St. Patrick to become again one parish. So St. Patrick today, still an immigrant story, right? We've come full circle. Approximately 80% Latino. 3 of the 4 weekend masses are in Spanish. The Wednesday evening mass in Spanish, full circle. The ethnic parish, hearing the word of God in their own language. The large families that ran up the census totals in all those parishes we've looked at. Ethnic festivals and traditions. I tried to find a picture of Father Juan riding the Father Juan riding the dancing horse, but the website's been scrubbed. And festivals like Our Lady of Guadalupe and the Quinceanera festivals for young women and so forth. And a picture that just stops my heart every time I see it. This is First Communion 2023. It's the St. Patrick children. They're at St. Edward because too big of a group to have First Communion in the St. Patrick building. That year there were 67 children made their First Communion. This past year at St. Edward, 93 St. Patrick children made their First Communion. And Father Juan, you said there are 500 children in religious ed at St. Patrick? 360. Still impressive. Okay, the future? Well, my out on this is I'm an historian, not a prophet. But we do know that the plan is that July 1st, 2026, one parish out of these 8 with 8 sites, a new name. So, you know, hypothetically All Saints Parish / Sacred Heart site / St. Richard's site. And then, well, again, I'm not a prophet. But let's reflect and remember, the parishes that make up our community of 8, as well as the 4 northwestern parishes, account for 1,577 years of history. And with all the gains that come from this further collaboration, the vibrant community, more people gathered together in one place for Mass, there will come a sense of loss and a sense of grief. And that too needs to be acknowledged and respected as those things unfold. So we'll face the future confident that we're guided by the Holy Spirit, and we shall see what we see. Okay, thank you.